She wore the same uniform as the men. She carried a rifle, saved her comrades, and killed the enemy. But when the Germans caught her, they did not see a soldier. They saw something they wanted to destroy, slowly, brutally, and without mercy. What happened to the women who dared to fight back is one of the least told, and most important, chapters of the Second World War: the hell of work and the whip. When we talk about what happened to Soviet women who were captured, we have to understand the system that was waiting for them. This wasn't just about being a prisoner of war. For Soviet women, especially those serving in the Red Army as soldiers, snipers, or medics, the Nazis saw them as unworthy of basic rights. They were usually separated from male prisoners and were sent to a world designed to destroy them, a world of concentration camps. The center of this universe for women was a place called Ravensbrück. The SS opened this camp in May 1939, even before the war officially began for the rest of the world. It was the largest Nazi camp built specifically for women. By the time Soviet soldiers liberated it in 1945, over 100,000 women had passed through its gates. For a Soviet female soldier, arriving here was entering a machine built for cruelty. The first form of torture was work, but this was not work meant to be done. It was work meant to kill. German authorities used women for forced labor under conditions so brutal that death was the expected ending. Imagine being forced to march miles in the freezing mud, wearing a thin cotton dress with wooden clogs that didn't fit. You were given a spade and told to dig into the frozen earth, or to haul heavy carts of sand up hills that were deliberately made slippery. If your body simply gave out from exhaustion and you slowed down, you were beaten. There was no mercy. As the war went on, the Nazis expanded their empire of suffering. In 1942, they set up a special compound for women at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most infamous death camp. Many of the first women sent there came from Ravensbrück. Later, in 1944, a women's camp was opened at Bergen-Belsen. Thousands of women were shuffled between these places like cattle, always ending up in a place where starvation and backbreaking labor were the daily routine. But the physical labor was only one part of the torture. The other part was the constant, random violence. In the camps and the ghettos, women were particularly vulnerable to beatings. The SS guards would use their fists, leather whips, or rubber truncheons. They would beat a woman for looking at them the wrong way, for dropping a tool, or for no reason at all. They just wanted to remind her that she was no longer a human being in their eyes. For a Soviet soldier who had taken up arms to defend her homeland, this was a double humiliation. She was punished not just for being a Soviet, but for being a woman who dared to fight. And then there were the experiments. German physicians and medical researchers used women as subjects for horrific human experimentation. They were used for sterilization experiments, where doctors would burn or cut the reproductive organs to see if they could prevent women from having children. Others were injected with diseases or had their bones broken and reset without painkillers to test infections. For a female soldier captured in battle, surviving the front lines often meant facing a fate worse than death, becoming a subject in a camp hospital where doctors, sworn to heal, acted as executioners with scalpels and needles. The goal was simple: destruction through exhaustion, violence, and medical terror. And if they were lucky enough to survive this phase, more terror awaited. Humiliation and the crimes behind the wire. The torture did not end with forced labor or the whip. When captured women were brought to camps like Stalag No. 337, not far from the town of Baranovichi in today's Belarus, they were separated from the men. About 400 women were kept in a special fenced area, surrounded by barbed wire. This was not a place of safety, it was a hunting ground. The guards who watched over them were often chosen from former prisoners of war or camp policemen, men who knew how to use cruelty to stay alive themselves. They became the most brutal of all. These men did not see the captured women as soldiers. They saw them as objects. Many of those women were attacked, raped, or threatened with death unless they agreed to live with a guard as his companion. This was a common pattern. A guard would pick a woman, and she would have to share his quarters, knowing that refusal meant a bullet or a beating. It was a slow, daily destruction. We know the details because years later, some of these men were brought to justice. In December 1967, a military tribunal in Belarus heard the case of A.M. Yarosh, the former head of the camp guard at Stalag No. 337. In that courtroom, Yarosh admitted what he and his men had done. He confessed that his subordinates had repeatedly assaulted the women in the women's block. His words gave a small voice to the hundreds of women who had suffered in silence. Another camp, Milarovo, held a similar nightmare. The woman in charge of the women's barracks there was not an ordinary SS guard. She was a German who had been born in the Volga region, a so-called Volksdeutsche. The prisoners gave her a chilling nickname, the Cannibal. She had complete power over the lives of the girls in her block, and she used that power to invent punishments that were as cruel as they were humiliating. The abuse in Milarovo was a brutal business transaction. Every day, for the price of half a liter of alcohol, the commandant would allow any policeman to choose a girl from the barracks. The policeman could take her away for 2 hours. He would bring her to his room, where he lived with another man, and for those 2 hours he could do whatever he wanted. She became just a thing, a possession to be used, mocked, and thrown back. One night, the chief of police himself arrived. A young woman was handed over to him for the entire night. Later, a German woman complained to him that the Soviet girls were reluctant to go with the policeman. The chief's reply was cold and grinning. He suggested a method he called the Red Fireman. It was a torture designed to break the spirit. The girl would be stripped naked and tied with ropes to the floor, spread-eagled. Then, a large red hot pepper was taken, turned inside out, and inserted into her body. She would be left like that for half an hour. Shouting was forbidden. Many of the girls bit their own lips until they bled just to keep from crying out. After such a punishment, they could not move for a long time. Their bodies were left shattered. But the commandant, the cannibal, was not satisfied with only that. She created other games. One was called self-punishment. A wooden stake shaped like a cross was made about 60 centimeters high, roughly 2 feet. The girl had to take off all her clothes, then lower herself onto the stake, inserting it into her anus. She had to hold onto the crosspiece with her hands while placing her feet on a stool. The goal was to stay in that position for 3 minutes. If she fell, if she could not bear the pain, she had to start again from the beginning. It was a punishment designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate, to make the woman an active participant in her own degradation. These were not random acts of violence, they were systematic. In camps like Stalag 3, 37, and Milarovo, the German authorities and their helpers created a world where the female soldier was stripped of her uniform, her rank, and finally her humanity. The abuse was a tool of control. And for the women who survived, the memory of those 2 hours, that half hour, those 3 minutes on the stake, they lasted a lifetime. Summary execution. Nazi ideology taught that women belonged in the home, not on the battlefield. So when German forces captured a Soviet female soldier, they treated her not as a prisoner of war, but as a criminal, a communist perversion who had to be destroyed. This hatred was strongest for women in combat roles. Snipers and scouts were especially hated. A female sniper had killed German soldiers from a distance using patience and skill. To the Nazi mind, this was unforgivable. When such women were captured, they were often singled out for the worst brutality. There was no Geneva Convention for them. The German military on the Eastern Front had already decided that Soviet prisoners, especially political officers and partisans, would not receive the protections given to other POWs. For women, the rules vanished entirely. The first stop after capture was usually interrogation. But this was not a simple questioning. It was torture designed to break the body and the mind. The Germans wanted information, troop positions, supply lines, the names of local helpers. But often the torture went far beyond military necessity. It became a punishment simply for existing as a female fighter. Reports from the time describe horrifying acts. Women had their body parts cut off. They were branded with hot irons, like cattle. They were burned with cigarettes or set on fire. Sometimes this happened right after capture, in the middle of a village, in front of the local people. The goal was to send a message. This is what happens to women who take up arms. One of the most famous examples is the story of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. She was a young partisan, just 18 years old, operating behind German lines near Moscow in late 1941. The Germans captured her while she was trying to set fire to their stables. They stripped her, beat her, and tortured her for hours, demanding she give up her comrades. She refused to speak. In the end, they marched her into the village square with a sign around her neck that read, "House Burner." They hanged her in front of the local people, and she was left on the noose for over a month as a warning. Her last words were a challenge to her executioners. "There are 200 million of us. You cannot hang us all." Zoya was not alone. Across the occupied territories, hanging became a favorite method of execution. It was cheap, public, and terrifying. When German forces captured a female sniper or a scout, they would often hang her in the nearest town or village, leaving the body on display for days. Sometimes they shot them instead, a bullet to the back of the neck or a firing squad in a ditch. But hanging was preferred because it was visible. It was a performance meant to break the spirit of anyone who might think of resisting. For the women who chose to fight, capture was never just defeat. It was punishment for daring to exist outside the role the enemy had decided for them. They knew the risks, they fought anyway, and some of them, even at the very end, refused to be silent.